So if you do have staff that you would like to share the webinar with, or if you miss parts of the webinar today, for some reason this webinar will be recorded and we will host it on our YouTube channel. So if you would like to share with staff or anyone at a later time, it will be available for you. The other thing that I want to let you know is that if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please use your chat box or your question box, whatever it's called for you, on the webinar toolbar that is on the right side of your screen. And I will periodically check that throughout the webinar to see if there are any questions or concerns from anyone as we go along. And we are going to go right ahead and get started this morning. So today's webinar is on creating healthy organizational cultures. It's part one of two pieces in the creating healthy organizational cultures piece, but is a part of our bigger self-care webinar series for February. And you still have time to register for the last two webinars in that series on our website at tncoalition.org. If that's something that you're interested in, just let us know. So we are going to go ahead and get started. As I said, today what we're going to talk about is exploring what we can do to mitigate past trauma with organizations who are traumatized and how to build resilience within those organizational cultures. We're going to talk about how to have some tough conversations about the past and future of our organization, and how to really foster healthy, transparent communication within organizations, and then ways to bring staff and leadership together. And as I said, in the second part of this two-part webinar, which will happen next Wednesday, we will be talking more about preventative steps we can take within organizations to build in cultures of resiliency and cultures of self-care to prevent trauma on the outset. So today we're going to talk about mitigating already existing trauma, but if you do want to register for the next part of this webinar, either of the two remaining webinars in our series, you can go to tncoalition.org/calendar. So, a little review from last webinar. So we had our first webinar in the series last week, and that was on the origins and dynamics of organizational trauma. If by chance you missed that particular webinar and you want to listen to it now, it is also available on our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is TN Coalition, and you can search for it there and get all caught up. And that's always a resource for you, but a little bit of review for those of you who weren't with us last week. So the three main causes of organizational trauma, or those roots of trauma, are single acute events. So this is things like, you know, if you had an earthquake or a tornado that destroyed the shelter, if you had a violent event that erupted in shelter, if you had a staff member who attacked another staff member or was accused of a terrible crime. Those are these big kind of explosive acute events that cause shock waves of trauma throughout an organization. The second type or root of organizational trauma is what we call ongoing harms. And these are things like lack of transparency, lack of communication, negative individuals within an organization, bullying from peer-to-peer or leadership to staff, things like discrimination within an organization, things like overloaded caseloads that are constantly happening, things like constant staff turnover. All of these things are ongoing harms that cause traumatization throughout an organization. And the third root piece or root cause of organizational trauma is unaddressed secondary stress. So vicarious trauma, vicarious stress that occurs within all helping organizations that is not addressed, that is not mitigated. We're not practicing healthy resilience within our organizations, and that stress is allowed to accumulate and accumulate more and more over time, and spreads throughout the organization and causes an organization to become a traumatized system. And so some of the basic characteristics of a traumatized organization, things that you'll see across most organizations that have experienced trauma, regardless of the type of trauma, is things like organizational stuckness, where we are not feeling like we're moving forward, we're not making progress, we're stuck in these same old cycles of stress and negativity. We are not taking on new projects, we are not making new connections in the community. So there's just the sense of being kind of stuck in that moment of trauma. Broken connections, so we are disconnected peer-to-peer, and we are also disconnected from our partners and our supporters within the community. So this shows up in a lot of infighting and clickiness and gossip happening. This shows up in, an unwillingness to work with outside organizations, unwillingness to let other people in, are some of the examples of these broken connections. The spread of secondary stress and anxiety from person to person. So while it is normal and expected for those who are doing direct care work, so advocates, therapists, counselors, to experience symptoms of secondary stress or vicarious trauma, what we're talking about with this piece is when it really just starts to spread throughout the organization. So you have people who never work directly with victims or survivors of trauma who are still experiencing secondary stress. So people on your finance team, people on your administrative team who are not seeing that direct contact but are still feeling the effects of stress and trauma because it's untreated throughout the organization. You have things like cyclical turnover, so you're constantly having staff turnover or batches of staff leave every few months. And then another big one is loss of connection to our mission. So we're losing passion for the work. We are losing this connection to the reason why we do the work, why we help people, why we work with survivors. And all of these things are basic characteristics of most, if not all, traumatized organizations. And so what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through a basic framework of how to mitigate the trauma from these three sources of harm, what that looks like, how we're going to mitigate the trauma, and then I'll bring you deeper into what those pieces look like and how to implement them within your organization. All right. So the first one that we talked about was acute traumatic events. So there's big explosive events that happen that leave your organization feeling adrift, feeling traumatized. And so the keys to intervening in the trauma from an acute event, or the keys to addressing acute event traumas, are to name the trauma, to make sure that we are not trying to sweep it under the rug, we're not trying to forget about it, but we're actually acknowledging it, we're actually talking about it, we're bringing it into the open, we're not trying to make it this hidden thing. The second piece that's really important is to normalize the responses to the trauma, those individual responses, and the way that the organization responds collectively. So support people's emotions however that looks. Everybody is going to respond to trauma differently, and especially large acute events like this. Some people may experience extreme anxiety. Some people may experience grief, anger, loss. All of these things can be, just like we know is exhibited within our clients who are survivors of trauma. You're going to see those emotional expressions in staff and in the organization as a whole, and we need to normalize it and allow it to happen, because we need to allow people to process those feelings in order to heal and move past them. The next piece is to identify our priorities and make a strategic plan for moving forward. How do we start moving past the trauma? What do our next steps look like? How do we start thinking about getting back on track with our work, and what does growth and change look like from this point? And sometimes it's a really good idea to bring in outside help, whether that is someone who is a coach or an evaluator who can work with your team as a whole, or that's someone from a funder who is there to do, to help you think about your strategic plan and what that looks like, whether that's someone who is going to work as a counselor or team builder for the staff, whatever that looks like. Don't feel like you have to address everything internally when these things happen. We want to give ourselves a chance to build those bridges, to reach outside and see what help we can find in our community and within our supporters, and within our partners that can help us move past this event. So this is kind of the framework that we're looking at for addressing acute trauma events. And the framework for addressing and intervening with ongoing harms is very similar. Naming the trauma, respecting our individual responses, containing anxiety with transparency. We're going to talk a little more about that later, but really making sure that we're communicating and being open so that there's not anxiety spreading, so that there are not rumors spreading. Make safe spaces to have hard conversations, bring in neutral outside help, and identify remedies and follow through openly. So obviously, as I said, this framework is very similar to that I just talked about with addressing acute traumas, and the reason that you have some differences is that with acute trauma situations, with organizations that have been traumatized by an acute event, the source of the harm, the source of the trauma, whether it was a violent person or a crime or a weather event, is typically gone in the aftermath. It's come, it's done its damage, and you're still feeling the effects of the trauma, but it's typically removed. The storm doesn't stick around. The person who's committing the violent act doesn't stick around. On the other hand, when you're intervening with ongoing harms within an organization, typically the source of that harm may still be there, or there may be multiple sources of harm that are ongoing, that are active in the organization that we have to address. And so the largest part of intervening is addressing the source of the harm and either creating lasting change or removing the source of the harm from the organization. And so that's why a big part of the framework here in intervening and dealing with ongoing harms is about communication, is about transparency, it is about bringing in neutral resources and openly and transparently following through with the remedies that you pinpoint. So for instance, if there is someone who is on your staff who is bullying others, who is discriminating against others, you need to identify that source and openly follow through with either reprimanding that person or removing that person from your staff. And be open and transparent about the actions that you're taking, because otherwise we're feeding into anxiety and rumors that are surrounding the ongoing harms and the source of negativity. And we're going to drill deeper into a lot of these pieces as we move forward, but I want you to really think about that. If ongoing harms are the source of your organizational trauma in whatever form they come in, the key to addressing it is to pinpoint the source and deal with it in an open and transparent way. And so the last one is mitigating, dealing with cumulative stress. When cumulative stress, secondary stress, is the source of your organizational trauma, how do you deal with that? What is the framework? And I said, for those of you who are with us in last week's webinar, I mentioned that cumulative stress is the most common source of organizational trauma within helping organizations, and it's also the easiest to address. Unfortunately, it's also the easiest to overlook because secondary stress and vicarious trauma are so common within helping organizations. Because as we all know, vicarious trauma is a part of, or a reality of, working with victims and survivors of trauma. We, as helpers, as advocates, experience that secondary stress. And so it's easy to just think of it as a normal, everyday part of an organization, and to a degree it is. The problem is when we're not addressing it, when we're not building in self-care and resilience to within our organizations, then it's going to spiral out of control, and you are going to have an organization that's not just experiencing stress, but is experiencing trauma. And you'll get that burnout, and you'll get that staff turnover, and you'll get those closed boundaries and closed borders. And it'll be harder to heal it than it will be to prevent it. And as I said, next week we're going to talk about more prevention, but today we're really going to talk about healing what's already happened. So the first piece of this framework is understanding how your organization's identity and culture impacts secondary stress. And part of that is the nature of the work. As I said, secondary stress, vicarious trauma happens to everyone who is doing direct services, direct care work. Another piece of that is our commitment to the work. Many individuals who are advocates, who are working in this field of direct care, whether you are an ER nurse, whether you're a first responder, whether you're an advocate, whether you're a social worker, whatever that looks like for you. Many of us do it for a reason, and that reason is typically because we have a history of some sort that makes us want to help others. And that's an amazing thing, but at the same time, it puts pressure on us to be constantly helping others and makes us feel guilty about trying to intervene and help ourselves. So that's where we have to watch and make sure that our organizations are treating self-care as a necessary and expected and encouraged piece of the puzzle, because that makes it then easier for our staff to take those steps. So the next piece of this puzzle is building and strengthening external and internal bonds. So we're talking about things like reaching out to community partners, building new partnerships with other people in our community. Take the time to find organizations, partner organizations, sister organizations that are excelling at pieces of the work that you're struggling with, and vice versa. So find an organization that is doing amazing outreach, but maybe not so great sheltering. but you're doing amazing with your shelter and you don't have time to do outreach. Partner with that organization, help each other instead of feeling like your organization has to shoulder that whole burden. Or, for a lot of us in helping fields, we see a lot of clients who have co-occurring mental health or substance use issues. Instead of feeling like your organization has to be the one to deal with that, partner with a community mental health organization, a community substance use organization, so that you are helping each other to provide a holistic service to your clients. Build scaffolding with organizational strengths. So what I mean by that is take note of what strengths exist in your organization. What are things that you excel at? What are pieces that you do well? What are strengths and ideas that your staff have that are unique and are excellent? Where are the pieces that you are great at? What makes your organization different and what makes your organization great? Recognize your strengths, understand the role your strengths play in the success of your organization, and build your strategic plan around the things that you're already good at. Build your plans around the things that you're already doing well instead of trying to do everything for everyone. Be the organization that excels at what you do instead of the organization that does 100 things in a mediocre way because you're so overwhelmed by the volume of what you're trying to do. And then that last piece is create norms around self-care and resilience. Build it into your organization's culture. Normalize self-care. Make it an expected part of your organization and your staff's day-to-day process. And make it part of your staffing and supervision. So as a leader within your organization, be checking in with your staff and how they're caring for themselves. Be creating opportunities within the organization to do self-care. And we're going to talk about this more as we move on, and we're going to talk about it even more next week. But I want you to understand what an important piece that is in mitigating this cumulative stress. Creating those norms around self-care and resilience are really kind of the foundation of mitigating this secondary and vicarious trauma. So I really like this, and this is from a book called Seeking Sanctuary, and it says the only way to effectively remove barriers to trauma-informed care is to become trauma sensitive to the way managers, staff, organizational systems are impacted by stress. So the only way to do a really good trauma-informed service delivery is to understand that trauma not only affects the clients that you're seeing, but it also affects the staff, the leadership, and the organizational system as a whole. So now we're going to dig into some of these pieces. So I talked about one of the biggest symptoms of this traumatized organization is this absence of trust and absence of connection from leadership to staff, from peer to peer, from staff to the mission of the organization. There's just a lack of connection that runs throughout the system of a traumatized organization. So that's one of the biggest pieces that we have to start healing, and that's one of the foundational pieces to all of the other frameworks of healing that we've already talked about. And so some symptoms to look for within your organization, if you feel like there's a lack of connection, if you feel like there's a lack of trust, the symptoms that you're going to look for, what you're going to be seeing, are staff who conceal mistakes, they conceal weaknesses rather than seeking help. So they try to hide their mistakes instead of seeking help because they don't feel like their peers or their leadership are supportive enough to help them learn and grow. And that's a real shame. You have staff who hesitate to ask for or provide constructive feedback. You have staff who hesitate to offer help outside of their own roles. So they're doing what they're doing and they're taking care of themselves and nobody else matters. And a lot of that comes from how stressed the organization is and how stressed the system is. And that sense of self-protection, I have to worry about myself because I don't have the energy to worry about what else is going on around me. You have staff and leadership who jump to conclusions about people's intentions. So, it may be a comment or a piece of constructive criticism that's well-intentioned, and staff will just assume that this is just a terrible person and they're just trying to be mean and it's just horrible. So there's an assumption of negative intent. You have staff and leadership who fail to recognize and tap into the skills of others. So we're not thinking about the strengths that exist within our organization. We're not thinking about the skills that exist. We're not thinking about how to move forward. So we're not recognizing and using the skills that our staff already brings to the table. You have staff who are gossiping, you have staff who are spreading rumors, you have staff who are holding grudges, and in general, you have a set of staff and leadership who are avoiding meetings, who are avoiding coming together as a group, who are avoiding having conversations because the connection has been lost. So how do we build it up? Because what we want is a team that seeks to learn from our weaknesses. We want a team that will ask for help. We want a team that assumes positive intent. We want a team that offers feedback and assistance, that appreciates the skills of others, that looks forward to group opportunities. So how do we build that? A big one is offer opportunities for team building. You can't build a strong team if you never bring them together. And so we want to offer both experiential and formal opportunities. And formal opportunities are things like workshops, bringing in an outside person to lead team building exercises, staff retreats, staff activities, meetings, team meetings and whole staff meetings, collaborative projects, doing things like communication style assessments. There's a great one that is called, I think, the colors test, where you see, you take kind of a little quiz and you see what your communication style is, and you can talk about it in the staff meeting, and it really helps to open our eyes about how we all communicate differently and we all want to receive communication in different ways, and understanding how each other communicates is a great way to facilitate conversation so that we're not misunderstanding each other. I might be someone who is very emotional and likes to talk about emotions and communicate in that way, and I may have a peer or team member who is very analytical and likes to look at black and white and likes to see numbers, and we may be clashing because we just don't realize each other's communication styles. So having those moments to have conversations about What are our communication styles? What are our leadership styles? What are our learning styles? To get to know each other better, to make it easier to communicate in ways that we can each understand. And so experiential team building is things like going out and doing something, going to lunch as a group, going to dinner as a group, going to the movies, having a special interest group like a book club or a knitting group or fantasy football or whatever that looks like in your organization. Going to an escape room, so one of those rooms where you have to work as a team to solve the puzzles and get out of the room, is a great piece of team building. If you're in an organization where your team or your staff are very active and outdoorsy, you may go to something like an obstacle course or go on a hike or go on a walk. Going for a walk together once a week or whatever that looks like, but having experiences together that are not necessarily work-related, because you're building trust and connection from peer to peer that will transfer over into our day-to-day work within the organization. Offer opportunities for feedback and encouragement. Have check-ins with your team about what's going on in their world, what projects they're working on, what they're doing, you know, what's been good that week. Regular supervision from leadership to staff. I cannot stress enough how important having that regular check-in and that regular time for supervision is especially when we're talking about a disconnected team, but any team needs that regular feedback, needs that structured supervision. Opportunities for staff sharing. Doing something like a team effectiveness exercise. And the one I'm going to give you an example of is pretty simple, and I'm going to warn you up front that it's going to seem very scary if you're coming from the perspective of a traumatized team and a traumatized organization, but these are things that we're talking about when we're opening up communication and opportunities for feedback. So this particular exercise, each person on your team will identify the single most important contribution of each of their peers that each of their peers makes to the team, and identify the one area that they must either improve upon or eliminate for the good of the team. And that seems very scary. All members must report their responses, focusing on one person at a time, usually beginning with the team leader. Traits that are identified must be work-related and constructive, not personality-based. It works best in small groups, and you should devote at least an hour to the exercise. So you're not speeding through this. You're really giving time to process and be constructive and being open and setting ground rules of having a healthy conversation, which we'll go into later. But things where the team members have a chance to talk about the positive things and the things that they're struggling with is really important. So connecting leadership and staff. And this is important in traumatized organizations because typically when you have a traumatized organization and you have those broken connections, one of the first connections that is broken is the connection between staff members and leadership. Because we are not trusting each other, we're not seeing transparency, and we're kind of closing off and taking care of ourselves. So reconnecting staff with leadership is a huge piece of rebuilding trust. So what does that look like? First of all, leaders must bear witness to what happened. Recognize and acknowledge the trauma. Trauma heals best when we name it and begin to talk about it. Give people time to grieve, give people time to process. And once they have had a chance to talk it through, once they've had a chance to grieve and process some of those negative emotions, then we can work toward integrating the trauma in meaningful ways. Foster insight and empathic connections. So part of this is helping staff understand the trauma that's happened and make sense of the trauma. Talking about what we each need in terms of healing, and things like, what does transparency and communication mean to each of us, and what do we need that to look like? And this also includes helping staff to grieve and understand what the trauma means for them on a personal level and what the trauma means on an organizational level. Because a lot of people in traumatized organizations are very afraid that either the organization is going to close or something catastrophic is going to happen, that their jobs aren't secure. So making sure that you are transparent and open and talking about their fears and what the reality is. And the other piece of fostering connections we've already talked about a little bit, but providing opportunities for learning, providing connection to sister organizations, to TA providers like the Coalition, to other organizations within your community. Help us get a new perspective, get new energy, and feel like we're moving forward. The next piece is leaders must be respectful of negative emotions, because negative emotions are going to happen. Understand that it might take longer for staff to trust change and to trust healing than for leadership, because staff are not always involved in planning conversations and on conversations about the future of the organization. And like I said, because fundamental symptoms of a traumatized organization are lack of transparency and breakdown of trust. So it's going to take a while for that trust to be regained. Leaders should take care not to be frustrated when your staff are expressing negative emotions, things like hurt, anger, frustration, grief, anxiety, that are going to be expressed throughout the healing process. You have to understand and be respectful that those fears and those negative emotions are just part of it. Contain anxiety and try to normalize the experience. Trust and safety are built on consistent, transparent communication. And that does a lot to contain anxiety, to stop the spread of rumors, to stop a lot of the fear that typically swirls around traumatized organizations. Allow mourning, and I think that one's pretty self-explanatory, but let people process their emotions. Let people mourn for, especially for things like acute traumas and ongoing harms that are being perpetrated. Let them mourn that. Let them be sad. Let them be angry. And then recognize their efforts to move forward and to excel at their jobs and to keep going despite the trauma the organization is feeling. Try to be a source of optimism, try to be a source of energy, champion organizational strengths, and help employees start to reconnect to the mission of the organization. Because it's really easy to lose sight of our vision and our mission in the midst of trauma. And part of healing and part of confidence building is remembering that mission, remembering that vision. Recognize good works in big and small ways. So, when you're supervising someone or when you're in private and you're commending someone on their work, but also in staff meetings, in leadership meetings, in team meetings, talk about the great jobs that people are doing, recognize their efforts, and model trust. So set expectations for ethical and direct communication, set aside time to institute systems for dealing with trauma, identify your priorities, things like focused staff meetings, making counseling available to employees, asking for outside help, hiring a consultant, all of these things. So be open about the things that you're doing to move the organization forward so that people know what the plan is, that they know what is going to happen, and that they can trust the process. Build trust and short-circuit rumors by being transparent. Give employees information about the changes that affect the organization. Keep lines of communication open, both in teams and among leadership and across the organization as a whole. Encourage daily communication of all kinds, whether that's team meetings or just chatting with each other about day-to-day operations. One of the most powerful things a manager can do is interpret what's going on for staff and explain to them what it means and what it's going to look like moving forward in specific, concrete terms. So be open, be transparent. Staff must have multiple opportunities to process and talk about the trauma and about what's going on and how they feel about it. And this has to happen both peer-to-peer, both staff to leadership, within team meetings, within staff meetings, one-on-one. There should be multiple opportunities to process this. To the extent possible, staff should be involved in strategic future planning because you want to involve everyone who is affected by future changes in that decision-making process. Staff should be encouraged to hold leadership accountable for their roles in implementing change. So again, when you say that change is happening, staff should be able to see that. They should be able to see the steps, and they should be able to hold you or hold leaders accountable for doing what they say and following through and implementing change and growth. And staff must also be given opportunities for personal development, for personal creativity and growth. Things like trainings, workshops, being able to voice their ideas and opinions, being able to suggest new projects or new services or bring their own skills and creativity to the job that they're in. They should be encouraged to be a full part of what's happening within the organization. And that's also good for the organization as a whole because you have staff that are better trained. You are recognizing and utilizing people's skills throughout the organization, and it's allowing the organization to grow in an organic way. And so then together, leadership and staff should be able to acknowledge the trauma and remember the history. In traumatized systems, we often deny or try to forget the sources of trauma, and in doing so, we often forget our organizational history and identity because we're trying to deny that something bad happens, and that this allows us to repeat that cycle of ongoing harms over and over. So acknowledge the trauma, be open about it, and open about the fact that we're moving forward and growing and learning from what's happened. Both leadership and staff should have opportunities for evaluation. Make sure that you're measuring what's happening, that you're measuring how your relationships both internally and externally with community partners are going, that you understand what organizational strengths and weaknesses are, that you acknowledge where strengths can build you up, that you're planning in deliberate and strategic ways, that you're including staff and community stakeholders in the process, and that when you make changes, you're talking about the results and you're evaluating, did it help? Did it make things better? Did it make things worse? Are there tweaks that need to happen? Create opportunities for internal and external connection. So the ways that you can find support both peer-to-peer and from leadership, ways to emotionally connect with one another, encourage staff to build broad social networks with sister organizations and partner organizations in the community, which creates a broader support system that sustains the organization as a whole and prevents trauma from happening again in the future. Because you have partners, you have people who are on your side, who are helping you grow, who are helping you change, who are helping you reach your goals within the community. We've talked a lot about identifying strengths, set priorities. So set clear, achievable goals, offer positive feedback, clarify goals, missions, and values as a whole, and be sure employees understand how any changes affect them, and that they are clear on what is expected of them, that they know what their goals are, that they know what their projects and priorities are, because that's part of being transparent, is saying, here's what's expected of you, here's what your role is. So all of those pieces will help bring together staff and leadership. And part of moving forward beyond trauma is having hard conversations, having productive conflict. So part of this is it's important to distinguish between productive, idea-based conflict and destructive interpersonal or personality-based conflict. Productive conflict is around concepts and ideas, and we're avoiding personal attacks. So productive conflict you want to think about more as debate versus destructive argument. So the goal of productive conflict is to produce the best possible solution through strategic planning, evaluating goals, evaluating the viability of projects and ideas so that we are seeing where there may be problems with things like, our strategic plan or our future goals, and we're saying, hey, this might not work and here's why, and so we're able to kind of nip those things in the bud on the front end. Often we gloss over these kinds of conflicts in favor of just forcing a consensus, because either one, we're uncomfortable with answering hard conversations about where our organization needs to change or move forward. We haven't fully fleshed out the decisions that we're making, and we don't want to be accountable for that. Oftentimes, leadership assumes that they know what's best, so either one, they don't involve staff in the conversations at all, or two, they tell what's happening instead of asking for opinions. And the reality is that most staff don't need to get their way in conflicts to buy into the final decision, but they need to feel like their concerns are being heard. So we want to make every effort to include anyone affected by a decision in the decision-making process. And as a result, people feel free to raise concerns and issues that they see, and once they have been heard and their concerns have been addressed, they feel free to support the decision even when they don't fully agree. So you have a greater opportunity for buy-in rather than just saying, here's what we're going to do, whether you like it or not, this is the decision that we made. And you have even people who might have agreed with that decision are going to feel like they're not a part of it, that's not, that you're not taking their concerns into account. So even if they would have been supported on the front end, that tactic of not including them in the conversation, not including them in the decision process, means that they're not going to buy in. The other thing that the hard conversations do is it allows us to build solutions. Like I said, it allows us to see where problems might happen and deal with them on the front end. It reduces gossip, it reduces anxiety, it reduces infighting, because you're openly communicating and letting people voice their concerns. And it opens the doors to discuss critical topics. It makes staff more comfortable with saying, this thing is an ongoing issue and we need to handle it, which prevents those issues from becoming cumulative and becoming trauma. And it allows them to say, here is what's causing my anxiety, here's what's causing my trauma, and find ways to mitigate it. So we have to be having these conversations. And when we have hard conversations, whether they are around the future of our organization or whether they are around the past trauma that has occurred, we have to think about some rules for making sure the conversations are positive and productive. So the first rule is give each other a break. It's not easy to have conversations around topics, especially if the conversation is about trauma that the organization has experienced. So it's important to reflect on the issues, but remember that many staff are still afraid, they're still in shock, they're still worrying and dealing with these negative emotions. So give each other a little bit of a break, a little bit of grace when we're having the conversation. Provide feedback on actions, not on people's characters. So in a traumatized environment, it's really easy to lose focus on ideas and instead start questioning people's motivations and attacking their character. It's easy to generalize from bad behavior to saying someone is a bad person. So we want to give feedback on specific actions. So instead of saying, well, you're only saying that because you're a bad person, what we want to say is, I disagree because this. And it has nothing to do with if someone is a good person or a bad person. It's about concerns and feedback and opinion. And it's important to communicate openly, and it's important to encourage an environment where people can talk to each other about conflict, but also help staff understand that if they don't feel comfortable giving feedback directly or talking about something directly to the person they're in conflict with, they can talk to a supervisor to mediate or to help them strategize around these conversations, and that there are always people willing to help facilitate hard conversations. So the next, number 3, is assume good intention but address impact. Most of us try our best to be helpful during traumatic situations, especially people who are in helping organizations, but we often end up saying things that are not very supportive. So things like, you know, everything gets better with time, and I know exactly how you feel, which are good, well-intended, but do not help. So what we want to do is understand that everyone means well. Assume that everyone means well. But when our actions are damaging, we still have to address them, whether or not they were well-intended, but we can address them without attacking the individual. Don't assume your reality is the same as others. Let's not assume that we know what another person is going through. In traumatized organizations, many conversations happen where people are dismissive of one another's experiences based on maybe how long someone has been at the organization or what their personal background is or what their financial background is. Don't assume that you know what someone else is going through in trauma. Accept that you know that your own reality and that you can't know what anyone else is going through unless they share it with you. Be gracious when accepting feedback. When someone gives us feedback, especially someone who comes from a different background from us, it's a valuable gift, and it often comes with a price for the person giving feedback because they have to put themselves on the line and trust that you're going to react in a positive way and not be defensive. So we have to work on accepting when we make mistakes, or accepting that even when we're well-intentioned, our actions might affect someone negatively. Give ourselves the grace to be imperfect, and give ourselves the grace to learn and grow. Number 6 is go high. Things like, if you don't give someone feedback on something that they're doing that's hurting you, it's unfair of you to get mad at them because you have not had that conversation. Don't spread gossip. Don't spread anxiety. And own parts that we may play in conflicts. And the last one is, don't take our work for granted. Avoid saying things like, this is not my problem, or I don't care what you do. If a problem affects the entire team or the entire organization, it's the entire team's responsibility to solve it, to brainstorm, to think of solutions. So I want to check in right now and see if anybody has questions. A couple of people are asking if you will receive a copy of the presentation. I am happy to send you a link to the slides if that's something that you want. And again, the presentation will also be recorded, so you will be able to access a recording of the webinar. Okay, so we are going to, I know we're hitting up on 11 o'clock, and so I'm going to apologize in advance because I am going to go over. And so I'm just going to let you know right now that if you are only planning to stay with us for an hour, and if you have other commitments, I completely understand, and feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And this will be recorded, as I have said. But if you can, I think we've got about 10 to 15 minutes left. So if you can stick with me a little bit longer, then we would love to have you. So as we're moving forward, we are going to talk about disconnection from our mission. So that's another one of those big things that people who are in traumatized organizations often find it hard to reconcile the organization's positive mission in the community with the trauma that they've experienced. So they get very disillusioned with the whole thing. Um, and with traumatized organizations, their mission often just can stay stagnant for 10, 20, 30 years. They create a mission when they create the organization, and the mission never changes. It never grows or evolves as the organization grows or evolves. So the work that we're doing in the present may be completely disconnected from the work that we were doing when the mission statement was created. So that also causes this big disconnect from what the purpose and mission of our organization is. The mission may not feel inclusive. It may not feel like it's evolved with the times. It may not feel reflective of the community and the clients that we serve. It may not reflect our strategic plan or the real work that we're doing day to day. And it may not reflect the actual values and the actual mission that our staff are working towards. So the work that our staff is doing and the mission that they are standing behind may be very different from what our stated mission is. So it's important to think about all of these things. And a lot of people say, well, the mission of my organization is just words. It's just a nice little paragraph or a few, pretty sentences that we put on our website and we never think about anymore, but it can be an incredibly valuable tool. So when we are reconnecting with our organizational mission and values, think about how you use it. Using our mission and our values as a team building and assessment tool. So right out of the gate, most people who work in helping fields and in helping professions, whether that's social services or advocacy or whatever it looks like, are awesome. They're here to help. They're here to do the right thing, but everybody is awesome in their own way, and everyone holds a different set of values within themselves. So part of our values as an organization can serve as an important factor in determining who we should bring onto our team when we are doing interviews and when we're talking to people about what their own personal and mission and values that they hold, in how they see those values shaping their career. It may reflect who we want to bring on our team and who we might need to let go from our team. Often negative conflict in teams occurs over misaligned values because we're not prioritizing them in the hiring and orientation process. So someone, again, it just like our communication styles, someone may value analytical communication, and they may want to have everything charted out in color-coded lists, and another person may be very emotional and experiential driven, and those things may clash. And that's just a piece where we can start talking about what our organization's values are and how those play out in our work and help each other communicate better. Use values to build organizational culture. Clear, defined organizational values can help shape the way that we work and create a functioning, happy, respectful organization. So, for example, if one of your organization's values is community, we value community and we want to build community within our organization. There are sets of behaviors that you can define around that. So if we value community, then one of these behaviors can be that everyone who is at work in the office that day is expected to kind of stop and greet and say hi to any visitor who comes in, even if it's only for a second or two. And this tiny, simple basic behavior can greatly affect how your organization is perceived by volunteers and community members, because people who are coming into your office, who are seeing smiles, who are being greeted by your staff and are being welcomed and feel like, you know, they're happy to see me. I'm welcomed here. I feel like I'm part of a community. And this is how values can build practices which inform your culture. We can also use our organization's mission and values to help resolve conflicts. So if you have clearly defined, clearly agreed to values, first of all, they can help prevent conflicts from forming in the first place, because we know what is expected of us and what we're working toward within our organization, and resolve conflicts when they arrive. For example, if one of your values is integrity, and the way that you define it is, we communicate our needs and expectations openly, and we don't get angry at others' failures to fulfill expectations if we never clearly set them. So we value integrity and open communication. Then this is going to inform the way that people within your organization work. They know that they're expected to communicate openly and clearly and share their expectations, which prevents a lot of those misunderstandings from occurring to begin with. And the last thing is, you should be using your mission and values to help you in your strategic planning. That's the main reason that they're there. Our values guide our development strategies. They guide our messaging to funders and donors. They give us a litmus test for any potential projects or grants or services we might want to add to see how those things fit within our mission statement. And it gives us a clear goal to work toward. So if you have to evaluate or create your mission and values to get that buy-in, to take the time to give staff opportunities for input and discussion, and not just have this flashy list of words that nobody really cares about. Because part of what we're trying to do is reconnect staff with our organization. Distill values into observable behavior. So spell it out in human language with behaviors that are easy to understand and easy to carry out. For example, respect can mean a lot of things. And if your mission is we respect everyone, that really doesn't mean anything unless you're spelling out specific observable behaviors. What does respect look like to you? Keep it simple. So respect may be that you do what you say you're going to do and you admit your mistakes. So don't complicate things with a whole list of like $5 buzzwords. Just say, we respect each other and we follow through with doing what we say we're going to do. That's achievable, it's observable, and it gives your staff something to connect to. Keep your mission and values visible. It's not just something that's on your website that nobody ever looks at. It's something that you print out, you put it on walls, you have it for handouts, for staff meetings, you talk about it. A really great idea or a great way to use this is at staff or team meetings, set aside a few minutes on your agenda to discuss how you've seen your values being expressed in the past week. How have you seen staff modeling your mission? How have you seen staff modeling your values? And share appreciation of each other based on what you've seen in action. Find ways to integrate your values into everything. When you hire people, make sure candidates know your values and your expectations around them. When you do performance evaluation, talk about how that person is embodying organizational values. When you collaborate with other organizations, sister organizations, and make partnerships, make sure that your missions and values are aligning. And discuss them and adapt them regularly. Make sure, like I said, that they're not just sitting there unchanged for 10 years. Think about how they should grow with you. And I'm not talking about, you don't need to do this even yearly, but when you're doing strategic planning, you should be looking at our mission and values and how that plays in, and do they need to be updated, and do they need to be changed? So, another big part of traumatized organizations is organizations that are avoiding accountability and responsibility. So this most often happens in organizations that are suffering from ongoing harm. And so you have resentment among team members who have different standards of performance. You may have one team member that goes above and beyond and another team member that goes bare minimum, and because you're not clearly stating your expectations, there's a lot of resentment between peers and between staff and leadership. So what you want to do is get rid of ambiguity, clarify your expectations, clarify your goals, make sure that everyone knows who needs to deliver what and what our standards of success are. Multi-directional feedback. So team members should have regular opportunities to give and receive feedback toward themselves and toward leadership. And then individual and group recognition. So if there's a collaborative project and you're recognizing that project, you should recognize that whole group. Or if you have a goal that you're working towards and everyone meets that goal, then you should reward your whole staff for working together and collaborating. And so the last thing, healthy leadership practices, trust staff to make day-to-day decisions about their own projects. If you can't trust staff to do their jobs, then there's other underlying problems that you need to deal with. Model respect, openness, trust, communication, give consistent feedback, model personal development. So learning should be constant. You should actually be seeking out opportunities to learn. Communicate regularly regarding what's happening within the organization, projects, expectations, goals. Set and model healthy boundaries. That may mean not checking your email when you're home or when you're on vacation. Give recognition and opportunities for feedback. So we've talked about all of these pieces already this morning, and I just kind of wanted you to see it as a whole, healthy leadership framework. And so the very last thing that I want to mention, and again, we are going to talk about it much more next week when we talk about preventing organizational trauma from happening to begin with, but we have to be able to normalize self-care within our organization. So the big question is, how do we shift mindsets around self-care so that stakeholders understand that it serves the organization's mission? And that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about framing self-care as a part of being successful as an organization. We're going to talk about peer-to-peer self-care and how we can encourage our staff to make sure each other are doing this well, and how self-care is a part of productivity. So all of this is going to happen next week. And again, if you want to register for that, you can go to our website at tncoalition.org/calendar. So I'm going to give a minute for any questions or comments or issues that anyone has. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it out in your chat box or question box on the right side of your screen. And I also want to point out to you that there is a little tab called Handouts on that toolbar as well. And under that Handouts tab, you will see a copy of the Creating Healthy Cultures Training Certificate. And if you click on that certificate, it will open in a new tab and you will be able to download and print your certificate of attendance for this webinar. So please take a minute before you leave to print your certificate if you need one for your records. So as I said, I'm going to give a minute or two for anyone to ask questions. If you don't have a question, or if you would prefer to ask your question in private, please do email me. You'll see my email on the screen, and I'm happy to chat with you about these issues. And again, take a second to make sure you download your certificate of attendance if you need one. Because someone just asked if handouts are available from the slideshow, because it is a Prezi presentation, it doesn't really lend itself to being printed. However, I am more than happy to send you the link to the slideshow itself, as well as a list of all the resources and tools that I've used. So if you want to shoot me an email, I'm more than happy to send you all of those links and resources so you'll have everything that I have. And as I said, I'm going to stick around for another minute or two and make sure nobody has any more questions. And make sure you have time to grab your certificate. Otherwise, thank you so much for being on the webinar this morning, and I hope to see you next week on our webinar next Wednesday, and have a wonderful day.